Welcome to our environmental seminar series. This is our next to last presentation. And this morning we have Dr. Kion Mallory from the philosophy department. Kion, thank you very much for taking time out of your schedule to come.
My pleasure.
And present this for us today. Unfortunately, they all know I have class this hour, so I have to get back downstairs before I violate the 5-minute rule and nobody's left. So I'll do that. So everyone, welcome, please enjoy the food, and thank you once again, Kion. So have a great day.
Okay. I'm going to quickly try to get a website here. So in my talk, I'm going to be drawing a little bit on some information and perspectives provided in this particular article that's online, so you can see it. Not all of it. I'm not just presenting these findings, but you know, it might be helpful to be able to read along, and you can write down the website. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I recognize many faces, and it's really nice to get to see students in different contexts. As you know, I'm a professor of environmental philosophy, and I teach environmental ethics and environmental justice and ecofeminism. But as many of you also know, my background is actually in environmental studies, environmental interdisciplinary environmental science studies and policy. So I love, and it's absolutely crucial to really developing ethical responses to the kinds of environmental problems that we face that different kinds of communities, discourse and knowledge communities that I'm going to talk about today talk with one another. So it's a privilege to be interacting with people in environmental science class and get that cross conversation. Okay, so what I'm going to do is going to be a little bit of a hybrid talk. I'm going to be doing some reading and of some things that I've written, and then just talking with you about some perspectives. I'm going to start out by holding up. This was my request for the Elma overhead projector, because you could just put things in front of it. But I'll pass this around. This is, you probably recognize it. It's a drink coaster, and it says Canada's response to global warming, and it's a Molson ad. Okay, right. And Canadian Sub-Zero, right? So it's funny. So I guess the message here is that the response to global warming is to have a cold beer, right? If you're getting warm, have a cold beer. But you have to ask ourselves, who's in a position to be able to kind of joke like this, and to be able to have access to be able to say that, oh, well, this is how we can respond to global warming. We can just open ourselves a cold beer. We can engage in some sort of consumer activity. Now, it's interesting, of course, that it's a Canadian beer. So Canada, of course, and other Arctic regions being some of the areas of the world that are, as you know, are most impacted most rapidly by climate change. But not all Canadians are situated equally in terms of the effects of global warming on their and climate change on their particular kinds of environments. So, so we can think about that, the commodification and the using for advertising purposes of something in a lighthearted way, of something very serious, climate change. And we can also think about, as I just said, who is in a position, who that's targeted at, and who would it be in a position to, respond to climate change by having a cold beer. The title of my talk is Who Knows? Ethics and Epistemologies of Climate Change and Environmental Justice. I'm going to explain some of those terms. So recently I spoke at a symposium that was called Varieties of Environmental Justice. And it was at the University of North Texas, and where I'm an alum of the program in environmental ethics and environmental philosophy. I guess I'll go ahead and have a seat here. And so while I was there, I had the opportunity to listen to representatives of different Native American tribes talking to the assembled audience of students, professors, community members, and environmental justice advocates about the importance of appreciating different ways of knowing and responding to environmental change in the struggle to devise sustainable and just solutions to the problems that we face. So one of those I heard was Dr. Dan Wildcat, and actually, I can actually pull up a picture of him. blocks in here. I loved the name Wildcat, and I think we need to have him here. Oh, this does not look so good. This isn't what I was. Okay, well, it's not coming up so readily. So he has a homepage, and I was just going to pull it up for you. But he is a Dan Wildcat, Dr. Dan Wildcat. He's a Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation of Oklahoma, and he is also the director of the American Indian Studies program at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas. Dr. Wildcat spoke of the need for empirical lived knowledges of environments. When deciding how to address a particular environmental issue, he said, and this is his quote, "We need to visit with the people who live there, who call these places home." So Dr. Wildcat said that this is not simply a matter of inclusion demanded by justice, although it is that, but by listening to the people who have a lived relationship with the land, air, and water and other beings that inhabit a particular area, it's that listening to them is crucial to be able to understand what is going on. So about climate change, Dr. Wildcat had this to say, okay, for Native peoples, it's a deadly, not an inconvenient truth. And to substantiate his point, he used the example of Inuit peoples not being able to rely anymore on traditional knowledges about determining whether or not the ice is safe to go on, whether to be able to rely on those knowledges now being unreliable. Intricate knowledges that developed in close relationship with a particular environment that go back as far as the language of the culture, so more than 8,000 years. Knowledges that have always, until right now, at this very historical moment, served to inform as to when the ice is safe for traveling and hunting and moving on, and when it's not. So here's an example of an epistemological loss, a loss of a kind of knowledge, and a story of conditions shifting and changing so rapidly that no developed human system of knowledge can predict what's going on, when the ice is going to move and crack. So what kinds of knowledges do non-dominant cultures and groups have that will help us to understand what's going on? And what kinds of non-traditional frameworks for understanding and relating with the world can we draw upon to help us deal practically, sustainably, and ethically with climate change and other environmental exigencies? Epistemology, in the title of my talk, it's a philosophical term, I'm sure many of you are aware, that means knowledge, or refers to ways of knowing, or questions about what counts as knowing or having knowledge. Contained but not always visible in epistemological questions are questions of who the knowers are. Whose knowledge or knowledge-producing practices are legitimate and whose are not. Some kinds of philosophy, such as feminist philosophy and environmental justice theory, challenges certain pervasive assumptions about knowledge, such as that true knowledge is always objective, and that objectivity and thus knowledge can only occur under a condition of material or physical and emotional, affective or emotional separation between the knower and the known, and from a stance of distance and separateness and removal. Such philosophies and movements also challenge ideas about who the experts are, and challenge the idea that only objective, neutral, and dispassionate Western-trained scientific experts can authoritatively speak to particular events, such as the effects of climate change, or claim to have certainty about what's happening in the world. I'm going to send another clipping and moving around. Okay, good job. So in this talk today, I want to speak with you about the role that alternative ways of knowing, specifically but not exclusively the kinds of knowledges held by women, people of color, and indigenous communities as a result of their lived situatedness in particular kinds of social, political, and natural environments, the role that these non-traditional or non-standard kinds of knowing or non-standard kinds of epistemologies can and must play in addressing global change. In an NSF-funded study authored by geographer Wendy Eisner, this is what's above you, environmental ethicist Chris Cuomo, and geographer Kenneth Heinel, titled Environmental Change, Indigenous Knowledge and Subsistence on Alaska's North Slope. The authors present preliminary findings of an interdisciplinary research project that links, and let's see, here's a quote. Since this isn't highlighted, I'll just see if you can find it. That links the knowledge and experience of the Inupiat Eskimo elders, hunters, and berry harvesters with scientific observations and methods to better understand environmental change on the Arctic coastal plain. So that's what this study does. So I know I don't need to convince you that global climate change is having a particular impact on polar and Arctic regions. And while I could recount their empirical findings, you could just pull this study up. It's available online. And I would also just be covering material that you've heard firsthand from other research experts that have presented in this very seminar series, I'm sure, including Dr. Kelman-Wieder and Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Granis and others. But I do want to share with you some of the ideas these researchers sought to convey in their report about the importance of local knowledges. Since it's kind of a lengthy quote, I'll see if I can find it. Okay, so in their words, I think I might have, there might be a printer version that I was working from here. So.
Right.
What's that?
On the right in the blue. It says printer version.
Yeah, let's try that. Thanks. So I'm looking for something that says eyewitness quotes on the ground, eyewitness observations.
I saw that.
Did you? Was it up further?
Further down.
A little further down? Thanks. Here we go. Okay. So not very pretty, but I'll try to scroll it up here to the top. Okay, so we're right around here, so you can follow along with me. Okay. Eyewitness on-the-ground reports can be crucial for tracking and interpreting specific changes and effects, or for assessing the relationships among various effects, as such specific details may not be accessible through scientific technologies and methods. As the literature on indigenous knowledge and northern climate change shows, native stakeholders' explanations of particular events, processes, and rates of change also provide important hypotheses for consideration, because local understandings include awareness of historical or contextual factors unknown to researchers from the outside. Global climate change creates local and meta-level situations that are quite precarious, and situations where local and scientific communities need each other's help. It is therefore not surprising that, in the Arctic and elsewhere, there is a small but growing body of scientific work that incorporates local or indigenous knowledge and perspectives, with hopes of improving scientific and ethical integrity of research by integrating important information obtained through direct observation, and by prioritizing the needs and interests of local communities. And that last part gets to some of the ethical implications of this. And I'm going to talk a bit about that here at the end of today's talk. So it seems like a no-brainer, right? But historically, a no-brainer that you would want to consult with local communities and people who have a deep and lived knowledge of particular kind of places and lands when you're trying to conduct your scientific experiments and gather data to really know what's going on. But historically, many obstacles have stood in the way of having the direct first-hand accounts of residents of particular places impacted by environmental degradation count in our knowledge-gathering processes. Many environmental justice movements have stressed the importance of listening to and taking seriously, and all those of you who are in the environmental justice seminar, right? This sounds familiar. Many environmental justice movements stress the importance of taking seriously the accounts of residents of particular areas that are being impacted by industrial pollution or something like that. But just as often, these communities have found their perspectives and their knowledges discounted, dismissed, and their calls for environmental justice delayed until experts could get in there and independently verify what the community knows to be true. or just as often, they're ignored and dismissed entirely, as happened in the case relayed at the same conference that I recently attended by Judge Luis Sepulveda of the West Dallas Coalition Against Environmental Justice. And Judge Sepulveda told us the story of growing up in his predominantly poor Latino community in West Dallas, and right next to many industrial sites as well, including a major lead smelter for the entire region. And he told stories of, as a child, playing outside and having lead ash from the smelter just like fall down upon him and his cousins and his brothers and sisters as they're playing outside. And he said, "Look, Mama, it's raining," or "No, it's snowing." And she's like, "No, this is Dallas, honey. I don't think so." No, but it was lead ash that was literally raining down on them. His nephew suffers from intense nosebleeds, as did many of his companions, many of his friends and relatives. There are lots of sicknesses. There were asbestos and lead levels registering at 20,000 parts per million by the EPA's own accounting. So the EPA actually did go in there and measure. But they were told that they couldn't determine whether their ailments were caused by the toxins in the environment, by the lead. And mothers in particular, who tend to be the ones who are most active in environmental justice movements, not just women, not just mothers, but women. And some of the reason for this is that it's because women are socially assigned the role of caring for others, children and elders and members of the family, and attend to the people who get sick and who know when people are faltering and know when something's wrong. So there's a kind of epistemology, right? There's a kind of knowledge. And talk to others in the community and find out that there are patterns, that this is happening not just in my household, but in other households too. So even though the EPA registered these incredible lead and asbestos levels and a whole cocktail of other chemicals, they were told by the officials, first of all, we can't say for sure, and you can't say for sure, that your illnesses are being caused by these environmental contaminants. And besides, if you would just stay home and bathe and take care of your children, you wouldn't be having any problem with your children. They wouldn't be sick. So they were told this. So not only are their knowledges of what's going on and what's causing the sickness were being denied, but the communities themselves were being blamed for the problem. And I might add, despite the lack of evidence on the part of the government officials who were telling them that the real problem here is that you're not bathing your children well enough. I could go on with other stories, and if time permits, I will. I recently attended yet another environmental justice conference, and that's really the most striking thing, is hearing how the people are working in their particular communities. I heard from an activist in the mountaintop removal movement in Kentucky, and of a community, an African-American community in Georgia. Very similar kinds of stories, but particular instances of local knowledges being discounted, the words of the residents themselves, the testimony of the residents themselves being discounted until there could be independent verification, right? Okay, so what we have are, so the questions about whose knowledge is counted, what kinds of knowledge gathering practices count, are the kinds of things I'm asking us to think about today. So to put this in a bit more academically, in a book chapter by the late environmental philosopher and ecofeminist pioneer Val Plumwood, a chapter called Rationalism and the Ambiguity of Science, Plumwood elaborates how the Western master narrative of rationality locates scientific and epistemic authority in a stance of transcendence, distance, and separation, of dispassionate disengagement, thereby producing a hierarchical, instrumentalizing relationship between the knower and the known. Although the dominant conception of rationality and knowledge holds that this purported separation and affective or emotional neutrality on the part of the researcher is not only necessary for objectivity and universality, both of which are supposedly preconditions for something called truth, and is certainly unnecessarily free of any political relations, Plumwood notes that a closer investigation reveals that it's otherwise. And then I'm going to give you a lengthy quote from here, from her, so you're just going to have to follow along with me. I don't have it up on a PowerPoint slide. So it says Plumwood, in the absence of care and respect for what is studied, and of responsibility to those who will be affected by it, it is inevitable that the knowledge relation is constructed as one in which the known is merely a means to the knower's ends, or the ends of power in which they, in the absence of respect and care, will come to serve. The presence of a politics is particularly clear when the item known is itself threatened for ratiogenic is a word that means generated by reason, as a result of what's been learned about it. Power is what rushes into the vacuum of disengagement. The fully impartial knower can easily be one who will bend their administrative, research, and pedagogical energies to wherever the power, prestige, and funding is. Disengagement then carries a politics, although it's a paradoxical politics in which an appearance of neutrality conceals capitulation to power. So it's not simply that those who hold that our ways of knowing must be predicated on a certain sort of objectivity have it wrong, but that there's a power relationship that's produced and reinforced by the demand that true knowledge of climate change or anything else must be objective and independently verified by those with no stake or personal commitment to the result. So returning to the Arctic study of the Inupiat, the researchers write about the limits of exclusively relying on GIS data to discern what's going on. Let's see if I can find on the tundra of Alaska's North Slope. So, a section on GIS here. See if I can see a heading that says GIS. Let's see. I know. I'll look at my printout here. Let's see where it's. Well, we can probably pull this up in a bit, because I'll just read you what's in here now, just to be able to follow along. So it's obviously not that far into the article. So I'm quoting, GIS technology is but one way of capturing, displaying, and analyzing data. And not all of the information given in interviews is geographically specific or easily translated into GIS points. For some questions or audiences, the narrative and interpretive information that is captured in narratives and videotaped interviews is more important.
Yeah.
Did you find it?
You can just find it a little below that.
So scroll down.
Yeah, just a little bit.
All right.
GI, there's.
Am I still? Should I still go down?
No, at the top you just lost it. But I don't know if it's the quote, but there's a GIS there.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll find it. So try to read along, and then you can look at this. So don't look at this, obviously. So GIS technology is but one way of capturing, displaying, analyzing data. I read that, so I'll skip over a bit. For example, as the testimony presented in the following section show, Inupiat elders' responses to questions about their landscape elicit reflections on life and livelihood that are quite compelling and instructive. And much of the very important information and analytic wisdom conveyed in the interviews is not geospecific or locatable on a map. With the recent proliferation of projects integrating local knowledge and spatial information technologies, a significant debate has arisen about the usefulness of GIS and other technologies for indigenous communities, and the tendency of such technologies to misrepresent traditional knowledge, or to reproduce the values of researchers at the expense of local communities' interests. Geographers Harris and Weiner present a list of methods and approaches that help create a GIS that is community integrated and progressive rather than reproducing existing relations of power. They argue that a GIS should be constructed with the assumption that local knowledge is valuable and expert. The project should broaden community access to technologies and data, and a GIS should integrate multimedia in order to maximize accessibility to community members. Now, as I said, I'm going to return to this last point about access by community members as one of the ethical demands of rethinking our epistemologies in just a bit. So getting closer to wrapping up this sort of prepared part of my talk, and looking forward to a conversation about these things. But let me return again to the perspective of Dr. Dan Wildcat. So he said that we, as a culture as a whole, have a lot we can garner from Indigenous and Native American knowledge systems. Dr. Wildcat spoke of knowledge being gained by being in the world. And I quote, he said, "Knowledge is experiential, not necessarily experimental. It is gained through a cooperative interaction with the land, air, water." He described a view that he called Indigenous Realism, not romanticization, that understands plants and animals not as resources but relatives, cooperating in the project of providing useful knowledges about what's going on with the planet, and also in revealing the best methods of addressing climate change. So is the natural so now we're on to another part. So not only are we asking, am I asking the question of whose knowledges count and whose knowledges have been excluded, suggesting that knowledges of indigenous and non-traditional knowers and experiential knowledges and direct lived knowledges need to be accounted for in our scientific responses and our political responses to global change. But now there's the suggestion that the non-human world is itself a partner in these kinds of knowing projects. So is it really a partner in knowing? Well, I'm going to read you some words from the environmental philosopher and eco-epistemologist Christopher Preston. So this is what we do in philosophy. We have texts and we read like long quotes from them. We don't have a lot of bar graphs on PowerPoints. Although I will say that the philosophy world is actually being positively influenced by sciences in terms of presentations, and they're getting more interesting. But I don't have one at this point, so I apologize for that. So I'm going to read to you then. This is Grounding Knowledge, Environmental Philosophy, Epistemology in Place by Christopher Preston. And he says, a reason why this is a good time to talk about grounding knowledge has more to do with the goals of environmentalists than with contemporary intellectual trends in epistemology. As photographs from space make startlingly clear, humans are located on a deeply blue, infinitely complex, and so far, apparently unique, verdant planet that supplies the conditions and possibilities for absolutely everything we do. It is clear that, in some sense, the Earth is literally the ground for all our knowledge claims. For the vast majority of species, for the vast majority of their time, the Earth has been the place from which they know. What those same images from space have also made abundantly clear is that each and every heady debate about postmodernism and epistemology takes place against the background of the systematic impoverishment of many of those biotic systems in the face of increasing populations and consumption patterns. It is now well understood that these consumption patterns come at the cost of a significant loss of the planet's cultural and biological diversity. Okay. Since traditional discussions of knowledge have generally assumed that human situatedness in a physical environment is not relevant to matters of the mind, this continuing impoverishment of natural environments has rarely been considered to have any detrimental effect on thought and belief. This book challenges that traditional account. As creatures who survive only because we are situated in delicate ecological relationships with the world around us, humans now generally recognize that we are connected on a biological level to the systems around us. Clearly, it is in our own biological interest to treat natural systems with care. I argue, that is, Christopher Preston argues, that humans, as creatures with minds operating through ongoing and active relationships with our physical environments, are also profoundly connected at a psychological level to our historical, biological, and geographical situation on this planet. This means it is not only in our biological interest, but also in our cognitive interest to protect these connections. For it is in these contexts that the human mind operates. Okay, so even the attempt to ground and locate theory and philosophy, that still probably sounded rather heady. What does this mean in terms of determining our ethical responses to global change? What's the relationship between our epistemologies and our ethics? Well, one of the primary tenets of environmental justice movements is that communities must be empowered to speak for themselves. That is to say that communities most affected by environmental changes should be considered the experts on what's going on, and outside researchers should conduct themselves with ethical and epistemological humility and really listen to the residents and even the earth and its creatures itself. Technological expertise and data, etc., is a tool put in the service of helping to identify and address particular problems, but it's only one way, one kind of way of knowing. Others are participating. Other participants, listening to the land, to elders, to long-term residents, and those who deeply care for particular places is crucial to gaining knowledge as well, knowledge that we can respond to, that we can then use to respond to. And second, I've got 4 points here, so this is my second point. So second, any knowledge is gained by outside scientific expertise should be given to the communities themselves to apply and deploy as they fashion their response on their own terms. And Patsy Cook, a Native American midwife, conducted a study of Native women to determine the PCB and dioxin levels in their breast milk, which is alarmingly high, as it is for all women on the planet, but Native women, and particularly women in the Arctic, because of the way that because of the circumpolar, the wind flows and things like that concentrate, and because of eating high up on the food chain, eating various mammals concentrates particularly in the bodies and the breast milk, and then thus gets transferred to the children of Inuit women and Native women. So she conducted a study of Native women to determine the dioxin levels, but the first thing they did with the result was to tell the women themselves, to give the result back to the community. It was drawn, the information, the data, the source was drawn from the community, and the purposes of the information was to give it to the community itself. They did not go and first report their findings elsewhere, nor did they tell the women, based on their findings, that therefore we have a conclusion, you should stop breastfeeding or something like that. When given the information, it was assumed that Native women were able to make the best situation, situated in their particular economic, cultural, and ecological context. So it's this sort of model, not having the sort of anthropology bandit model of going into communities and places and getting knowledge and then taking it elsewhere, a sort of colonialist epistemological model of gathering information and then going elsewhere and putting other kinds of information, but putting the knowledge that's gathered through scientific and other kinds of knowledge gathering processes to work in those places. And then, so third, that was my second point. Third, we don't need to shy away from the idea that knowledges are political. And I imagine this might be a provocative point in this audience, and maybe we'll talk about it, I hope. So we've all seen the horrible effects of 8 years of politicized science from the Bush administration on the topic of climate change. Articles like this, but this is one scientist denying that he was politically pressured to change the results of his study. We know and knew all along, but it's become screamingly clear that there was lots of politics going on with the politics of climate change and results of not the IPCC, but of White House and EPA kinds of findings and documents. So we've all seen the horrible effects of 8 years of politicized science. But the most ethical response is not to make science more neutral, because it never was that in the first place, I submit to you. Why shouldn't knowledge projects, scientific and otherwise, be interested, concerned with particular points of view? If we acknowledge this, then we can really have a conversation about the ethics and the values we want to promote and those we don't. Okay, the process through which we do this is that inexact science called democracy. And no amount of scientific expertise makes one voice any more or any less entitled to be heard in the public sphere. So my fourth and final point here, this is just a little bit more anecdotal. I'm going to see if this is the case. So I've been hearing that some ecologists want to change the name of their field or their discipline because it's become too associated with something political, that the ecology movement, right? That ecology has come not to refer to a science or a kind of scientific inquiry, but something else, like a movement, right? Well, I want to say, why is this a problem? We don't expect medical doctors to be neutral on questions of human health, And we don't think that they are unjustifiably biased if they use their intimate and intricate and well-developed knowledges of the human body to argue for practices and policies that promote the body's well-being. So why ecologists and environmental scientists should be concerned about appearing to advocate or having an advocacy position, I'm not sure. Unless it relates back to the idea that epistemologies are bound up with power, and that currently humans have power over the rest of the Earth's inhabitants, and maybe there are forces out there that don't want us to give that up. So to conclude, I'll tell you one last story from the Varieties of Environmental Justice Conference. And this time it's from the words of Casey Camp Hornick of the Ponca Indian tribe in Oklahoma. So there were several presenters, and one of the keynote presenters was Dr. Kristen Schrader-Frechette, who's a very esteemed biologist and philosopher. She has training in both fields and an appointment in both fields at Notre Dame. And she works very tirelessly and strongly on environmental justice issues, and she consults with many scientific and governmental agencies. So she presented lots of bar graphs and lots of data and lots of, to make this compelling argument that we all must respond to problems of environmental injustice because we're all ethically implicated in it. But Casey Camp Hornick, so Kristen Schrader-Frechette had a particular kind of social location. She is a white woman of German background. She's a very esteemed professor at a very recognized university. As I said, she consults with government and with other kinds of scientific agencies. She's very respected, taken very seriously. Casey Camp Hornick does not have any of those labels and degrees. After her name is really funny. What did she say? She said, yeah, I have a degree from MIT, matriarch in training. That's one of the things that she said. And the BIA is in there somewhere too, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Okay, so Kristen Schrader-Frechette, they got in a discussion about something, about the meaning of particular kind of data, and Kristen Schrader-Frechette said to the audience, she said, well, I could give you the data about this. And Casey Camp Hornick, she said, we live the data. So what was going on there is that Kristen Schrader-Frechette, Dr. Schrader-Frechette, was very well intentioned. But Casey Camp Hornick was calling us to remember that knowledges are lived knowledges. Okay? They're not just in bar graphs. And they're always situated and always experienced differently. So having the experience of her community and her people and her life transformed into, sort of data points was, I think, somewhat disturbing to Casey Camp Hornick. And she was calling us to remember that these knowledges are lived knowledges and always situated and always experienced differently according to one's position in a biocultural world. So knowledges are partial and perspectival, but that doesn't make them less true. And if we pay attention to who is doing the knowing, who knows, then we just might learn something. I don't know how much time we have left here?
Yeah, we've got some time. So
okay.
So
is it 45 after that class ends?
Yeah, I usually try to end at about 12:30, so I have an
Oh, okay.
slot. But,
okay, great. So my timing worked out well, I'm guessing, with maybe 15 minutes for Q&A. Okay. Well, what do you think? John?
One of the things that, one of the points you made about the power and the funding being a major driver, and I think that's definitely true. And I'm wondering, are there any enlightened funding agencies that are in fact funding projects to bridge that gap and to really bring in that lived experience and really involve those local, if I can use the word, stakeholders, people living in a particular area with these various other approaches and various other kind of things like the biology of climate change or whatever.
GIS technology.
All the scientific data. Are there any agencies that you know of or any funding entities that are funding that kind of interface?
Yeah, I don't have a deep and thorough knowledge, but this is one study that was funded by the National Science Foundation and brought together geographies and environmental philosophers. And if you read the text throughout here, they, you know, stress the importance of the participant interviews, going along with the GIS data, going along with and bringing that back into the community, and also knowledge as being sort of a community held thing, rather than like, so stories would get told about the shifting or the changes in the lakes, which was what they were specifically going to research, were particular karst, something like that, I don't know it. Lakes that flow through where the permafrost has been melting, and how that affects the structures on the community and the community. So okay, so this is one example, and so you know, so here's a figure from you know, some of the research methodology is through participant through interviews. Also, I did. What is it? Jonathan Cook. The EPA is actually, this is really interesting. I need to look into this a little bit further. Jonathan Cook is the director of the EPA Native Peoples Affairs Bureau for District 6, which is covered by Dallas. And he and colleagues have been, and he is Native, and I don't know what tribe, and he and colleagues have been pushing for years to get these kinds of qualitative, non-quantitative factors considered in environmental impact reports that the EPA does. And apparently there is now, I don't want to call it a pilot program, but they're actually going to try to implement this and build this into in the process of generating environmental impact reports. Maybe you know a little bit about it. Things such as the impact on the value and the cultural traditions and the heritage of the community. Things that have been left out of, excluded from environmental impact reports because they're non-quantifiable, right? They're these kinds of messy, how do you measure something like the impact on a community? But it's very real. So I think that that's going to be really interesting, and I'm very excited about that. And I'm also very interested to see exactly how that's going to kind of work out in practice, how an environmental impact report has to include considerations of impact on the community, loss of cultural values, and if cultural values that are tied to being in particular places and interactions with the environment in certain kinds of ways. So there's a couple of examples that I can think of, and hopefully, and I'm sure that there are more coming along. But yeah, and maybe others know. Yeah.
Well, sort of going along with that, I guess my question is, what's your sense of sort of where things stand today in the sciences in relation to this? Because I would think, and I think this is largely driven by this sort of idea of climate change and global warming, that certainly a lot of the scientific organizations that I belong to are starting to embrace this idea that that scientists do need to play a fairly active role in advocacy. Mm-hmm. Caution, you know, sort of being cautious about how they do it, mm-hmm. but that it's being pushed a lot. That it's, hey, you're not supposed to be a dispassionate, you know, observer, but you are actually supposed to, you know, take off your scientist hat at one point and put on your advocacy hat sometimes.
Or maybe not take off the scientist hat, but put on the advocacy hat at the same time. Scientist advocate.
Yes, right. Exactly.
I mean, is that becoming okay? I mean, I guess that's my question for you. Well, anyway, continue.
I mean, that is an interesting question, because I think there is certainly still this epistemology of, to be a scientist, you cannot be an advocate at the same time, mm-hmm.
Which I think is
probably breaking down, and I'd be interested to hear what other views on that are. But I think that's still fairly strong, that feeling that you can't necessarily be both at the same time.
Yeah.
So that there is this sense of taking off the hat and putting on another one. You know, not sort of like losing your knowledge as you do so that you're still using your scientific knowledge and advocate. But
now I'm speaking as an advocate, right, not as a scientist.
Exactly, making that clear break.
Yeah.
Saying, you know, now I'm not talking as a scientist. But I think, and largely because of sort of the politicization of science with this previous White House, with the idea that there is, you know, with climate change and hey, you know, we really need to do something, that there is this push with a lot of organizations to play, maybe cautious, but play a role in advocacy.
Yeah.
And sort of how you see, if you're, I don't know, sort of the evolution of this over time, if you do see that, and if there's a big difference today.
Well, I think you and your colleagues and and students could in the sciences could speak more to this than me, because those aren't the communities that I'm directly involved in. But I do know that there is this perception, all the things that you're just saying, that if you advocate you're not as good of a scientist, or that's misusing science, or that it's not to be taken seriously. And if there is a shift occurring, I applaud that. I think that's good. I mean, we do wrestle with it in all kinds of disciplines, and philosophy as well. This idea that you have like pure disinterested knowledge or study of a thing. But feminist and environmental perspectives say that you're even claiming that there ought to be neutrality, even saying that true knowledge should not advocate for something or is not meaningful. What that does, that's actually an interested position. That's actually a political position that what it does is reinforces a status quo. So that's actually coming out in favor of the status quo usually. So, but then it's concealed under this like idea that's it's objective and neutral. So the argument is look, why not be very upfront and direct about the kinds of political stances we're taking, so that then we can talk about whether this is good or this is not good. What are the values? Whose positions, whose interests, whose whose ways of affairs are being reinforced by this, and whose wouldn't, and then we have to wrangle with it as a culture, as a collective, as a people, as a global people, or in particular communities. I don't know. Do others want to discuss, say about the sort of status of interested science?
Well, my perspective is that the risk for scientists of getting too involved in advocacy is that there's a difference between advocating the conclusions that are supported by analysis as opposed to selective use of data.
Okay.
And those are two very different things, and the general public doesn't know the difference between those two things. So what's been going on for 8 years is ignoring a lot of data and selectively cherry-picking other data that happen to fit the priorities of the people in power. And so people think that there are no other data. And so it's not, most scientists would think it's a slippery slope to counter that by going to the opposite extreme, which is to cherry pick the data on the other side and pretend that the conclusions are much simpler than they really are. That's not being waffly and promoting the status quo. It's
wanting to preserve the integrity
doing
of
what scientists do in terms of evaluating the data dispassionately, in the sense that you base your conclusions on what the data tell you, not on what you want to be true, and you just find data that support your position.
Yeah, no, point well taken. Yeah.
I think when President Obama was talking about the stem cell decision, he was trying to deal with that we'll base decisions on whatever the science says, whether it fits our personal, or our democratic or whatever philosophy or not, but there's the ethical dimension that also has to be taken into consideration. So, there's sort of a science advocacy, but there's also an ethical advocacy that then have to kind of tussle with each other before final decisions made. So there's an advocacy for science itself, which is sort of part of what he was saying, but it's not. That's not the whole story. That there has to be something bigger than that that's considering, society and values and things which is more of a political, some combination of political and philosophical.
And that's right. So the ethical positions, the values that people hold that are represented by different groups are part of the debate, as is the science. So I agree that saying that this needs to just be based on the science is itself advocating for science as being the only kind of consideration. And I think that's absolutely right, saying that there are those who have very good positions, very good ethical or moral or value-based reasons to either agree or disagree with a particular kind of practice, stem cell research, or recently the release of Plan B for being sold over the counter to 17-year-olds, and they say that this decision was based exclusively on this, ignored the science of it. And it's true, it's disingenuous to say, oh well, the reason why we're withholding this from 17-year-olds is because we're concerned about their health. When the science doesn't show that, that's a disingenuous and a misuse of science, and as you say, that's cherry-picking data and maybe even just grossly distorting the data. But if you want to just be upfront and say what this debate is really all about is whether or not we think 17-year-olds should be able to have access to emergency contraception and what that means about our society values, about teenage sexuality and things like that. That's the discussion we need to be having, and that just needs to be part, and that can be part of policy decisions, because those are ethical conclusions we need to come to as a society. But to just say, oh, you know, the science says or does not say that it's okay or not okay is kind of missing the point. I wanted to return to something you said, Bob, about, and the public doesn't know the difference, like the problem with cherry, you know, the difficulty, there's a difference between advocating for the conclusion that your science, that your data leads you to, versus cherry picking data and then arguing for a conclusion, and the public doesn't know the difference, and so you want to preserve the integrity of science. I concur, but the solution to that, of course, is it shows that then what we need is a scientifically literate population.
Very nice.
And, you know, so because these are still democratic issues and issues for the public sphere, so we have to be able to say, wait a minute, you know, like what's going on in, you know, with climate change data or something like that.
It would be nice to start with a scientifically literate media, but we don't have that.
Okay.
And so we don't, I mean, it's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I might say let's skip the media, since the media is so corporate controlled. And media has particular interests and points of view. And so again, what scientists, what scientific experts get displayed, who gets to voice the official point of view, those are all political decisions. So again, it's not that we need to get away from the politics, it's that we need to be more transparent about the politics, and then an educated and democratically involved population can get involved in the debates. So yeah, and then hopefully it'll be more glaringly obvious when particular facts or data is being cherry-picked to support a certain kind of conclusion.
There is, of course, the ethics of pseudoscience. There's the ethical aspect of lying about the information.
Yeah, well,
the ethics about whose points of view do we incorporate, but there's also the issue about integrity in general, not just scientific integrity, but
yeah, integrity about your methodology and processes. I mean, I think peer review is one of the best and most rigorous ways to produce knowledge and get it through from those kinds of communities, and helping people to understand that and understand how that process works, and getting people involved in it too. So considering these some of the peers that are reviewing the data and information, who are, you know, so a wide variety of kinds of communities and voices and perspectives. So from the environmental science students, what do you see your role as environmental scientists, and what other kinds of uses you're going to put environmental science to? What's the role of somebody with an education in environmental science in talking about climate change or any other kind of environmental issue? Do you have an advocacy obligation? Is it okay for you to do advocacy? Do you have to do advocacy? Is it not okay for you to do advocacy? You're all thinking. You're going to say something. You're thinking about it.
Not actually an environmental science student, but it's something of interest to me. I don't know that much about it, and I think it's important for people who do. I know I've reached out to friends to be like, hey, can you explain this to me? Because it does affect all of us, and not enough people understand it. And so I guess the role of other students would be to kind of maybe explain things. And I know just listening to things that do get kind of esoteric in science talk that I might get lost in, if there's kind of some kind of way for people to just present things like clearly and more simply for, I guess, the rest of the population, because you don't see that like in the media, or you really have to like just find environmental science journals and things, and I might not be able to get through that and understand it all.
Yeah, so environmental scientists, some can be interpreters in ways to explain how it works and to translate those kinds of knowledges into, so that they can be debated in the public sphere without everybody having to go to the science journals.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Well, I think also as the media has kind of picked up on climate change, and there's so many things out about, you know, green living and the decisions that people should be making within their lifestyles, that, you know, some of them are uninformed decisions, and they're coming from, you know, the wrong place, and you know, some people might be advocating for nuclear power, but they don't understand the waste involved in that and things like that. So I think just personally for me, listening to other people kind of have discussions about what they've seen on television and read in the newspaper, they might not understand the full implications of certain actions and, you know, how to weigh them out and make lifestyle decisions or political decisions and things like that.
So some of the role for somebody with training in environmental science or some education in it is to help to sort out what the consequences of some kind of choices are?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the hype lately has been slightly uninformed, or maybe some people are focusing on certain things thinking that it has a greater impact than it does, or, you know, I think that it can be slightly skewed, not that all the attention is a bad thing, but I just know that there have been some instances where I've been having conversations with people and they don't really understand either the full implications or the consequences or how things actually affect ecosystems or systems in general.
Yeah. Right, and that's very obvious when people say, how can there be global warming when it snowed in Georgia like it did a couple of weeks ago? You know, like how, you know, and saying, well, this is why it's climate change, and this is actually how the model works. So being able to actually explain those kinds of things and have a role in making sense. I mean, these are complex phenomena, complex events, and science and scientific epistemologies have a really important role to play in understanding and getting those ideas out there. But some of it are things that we have to do as a culture. We have to be able to embrace uncertainty and still move ahead in the face of uncertainty, and also to be able to just talk about the ethical implications of things and realize that these kind of come down to values considerations. And so if we just say whatever the scientists say is what we should do, is in itself saying that a particular kind of knowledge or a particular kind of way of thinking gives you the ethically or morally correct answer. And so science is a tool, one kind of tool among many, just as within science itself there are different kinds of tools and different kinds of knowledges for information.
Sort of interested in the quote you're reading from the book, where this the idea that the non-human world is very important for our cognition, for our ways of thinking. And to sort of take two extremes, you have the child growing up in a native village who's got very close ties to the land, to the non-human aspects of the world, versus, you know, a kid growing up in Manhattan who's, you know, on the cell phone 10 hours a day. And obviously there's a lot in between there. But sort of what is that, and this is sort of maybe a can of worms, but what does that do to thinking? I mean, in terms of our cognition, what is that? Because the child on the cell phone also sees, you know, the picture of Earth from the moon, you know, the moonrise picture, which I think, in a lot of ways, kind of revolutionized, you know, our ways of thinking about the Earth as one system. And this concept, you know, maybe this kid takes an environmental science class or environmental ethics, and so maybe has a more global way of thinking about things, but is much less directly connected to the land. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with Preston that when we reduce biodiversity or don't have very limited kinds of interactions, and interactions are with a really technologized environment, that it structures our thinking in certain kinds of ways, and it truncates our thinking. So biologically diverse and rich environments and constant lived interaction with them, I think, creates ways of, like, literally neural pathways or cognitive path. I don't want to say neural pathways in the neuroscience. I'm not going to say it actually grows your dendrites, because I don't know whether or not it does. And actually there is some evidence in here that this book cites about how that happens on a biological level. But I think certainly that cognitive pathways, possibilities, understandings are opened or foreclosed by the kinds of interactions. Now, I don't want to say that, I don't want to privilege, so therefore you have to be Native American or you have to live on the land or something like that in order to think creatively and openly about ecological problems and have a rich understanding of the environment. I think you can do that in urban spaces. I also think that the environment is everywhere, and we don't want to just say that the environment is out there and that cities are not environments. But but how we think about it and just the notion of diversity, of like, why is biodiversity good? Why do we advocate for biodiversity? Because when you have biodiversity, you have many more sorts of options. You have other kinds of solutions. And then there's also something about diversity that seems to be intrinsically good because it's interesting, because it's creative, it's proliferative, and those seem to be biological, ecological goods for their own sake. Both on a practical level, but then we lose something about what it just means to be beings in the world when there are less of the other kinds of beings. And I think the same kind of thing is true with kinds of environments. So if all you're doing is being on the cell phone and in the Wii and in inside spaces, your experience, your ability to care about places and to think creatively about environments is going to be truncated just from loss of experience of them. That's my view. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's sort of a can of worms. I definitely, it seems like there's that lack of connection for a lot of kids growing up. I think is, for me, sort of troubling. That there's always sort of an electronic gadget around, but I don't know. I mean, because on the flip side, I would say, if you visit Manhattan, the amount of kids there calling themselves environmentalists saying will probably be fairly high and probably fairly knowledgeable about, I don't know what knowledgeable, but they're aware of a lot of these issues, would be my guess. I mean, they're not necessarily scientifically literate, but they are aware of it. So I don't know. I'm just I don't know what I think. I'm just curious.
I think the key might be lived interaction. And so you can definitely have a lived interaction with the natural and cultural environments in urban spaces, but that's sort of a mindfulness and awareness and a conscious living involved. So nowadays kids are in cities and everywhere are getting lots of kinds of environmental education that maybe they weren't in a previous generation, definitely. I mean, we just went to the Academy of Natural Sciences and we saw lots of what appear to be school children from various boroughs, non-privileged boroughs and places in New York City. And just that kind of like thinking about you live on a planet, or you live on a place on a planet, and here's some environments. The turn to urban gardening and urban agriculture and sustainable agriculture and community gardening and things like that as ways of getting people, kids, people of all generations and communities to interact with each other in the community and interact with the natural environment that's in their space, and seeing the natural and cultural as not being so separated. So I think it's not just where you live or whether you have electronic gadgets, but the sort of, if you're just behind your cell phone and never outside of the apartment or the subway, then that's one kind of thing. So because people in rural areas can also have a distanced relationship from the natural world too. So that's where the richness of the physical environment, but also being there with the stories and with the kinds of interactions that make it part of your cognitive processes, your thinking process, I think is important for that.
Community of people within conservation biology and related areas who are interested in that issue of how biological diversity affects the way we think about the world. Our mental medal winner from a couple of years ago, Canopy Meg, one of her programs is No Child Left Indoors. So
I like that.
She's a good representative of the appreciation that exposing kids to the natural world and what it means to their cognitive development. There are a lot of people writing about that. E.O. Wilson and a lot of other people have addressed those kinds of issues. So.
Yeah, and then there's a popular book called, what is it, Last Child in the Woods by Wood or something like that.
Almost any conservation biology textbook, even a very introductory textbook, will touch on that issue. So it's in there.
Yeah.
The other reaction I had to some of what you were touching on, and this goes back to Dr. Rogier's lecture, was about, I think there's a little bit of a risk of painting too broad a brush about the value of resident experience, because I think it's important to be aware of the fact that it's one thing for a community that's been resident in a place for a long, long time, where many generations of people have a relationship to the land and the organisms of an area. But there's so many places around the world where that's not true anymore. And so just because there are people there who are not white Anglo-Saxon folks doesn't mean that their sense of what's important and what's true in their area is very well grounded because there's so much movement and change that so there may be a community in a place that's relying on the land, but they've only been doing it for one generation. So in Latin America, we see that a lot of communities that think they know what's going on, but they really have no clue because they've been there for 50 years. So that's kind of scary.
Yes, we have to be careful not to romanticize or idealize any particular kind of people and say there's automatically, you know, a deep and lived knowledge. Women have a deep and lived knowledge of the land, or indigenous, you know, Native Americans. It's not by virtue of being a woman or being a mother or being indigenous, but it has to do with those stories and those lived relationships. And do they go back, you know, generations, and how are the stories or the knowledge is passed on? Have they been passed on in particular kinds of ways?
Environment, and are maybe even involved in a lot of the environmental movements that are happening up there. But at the same time, there are also very distinct examples of people that are from the Native community but are now enjoying kind of the privileges that come along with all the development that's happening. And, you know, maybe work for Shell or whatever. And so then when they have interactions with us and we tell them what we're doing, kind of trying to make them more aware of the effects that perhaps development for Shell is having on the ecosystem there, they just don't care and they don't see why they're there. And they, you know, they'd rather have a mall than have people up there. And that's kind of amazing to me, and also kind of problematic in that the ideas that we were talking about. I definitely agree with them that maybe people can have better experience in providing their knowledge at the same time as virus. I think that's where the problem comes.
Is there a generational difference between those who want malls and?
Definitely the elders are not the ones that don't care about the environment, and they're mostly, I guess, no-care men who've now started working with Shell.
Yeah, and that's another, that was my next question is there an economic incentive, or are they being employed by Shell and things like that? Yeah, so, right, and so it's a warning against looking even at cultures and groups as hegemonically having the same kind of position or perspective, and there are debates that are going to be internal to communities and need to happen. But some of what it sounds like is we need to at least look at the role of the power of dominant American mass consumer culture in shaping the value system. So I'm not saying that those young people don't really have those values. I'm not going to say those aren't really your values. Those are fake values. Those are, you know, those are their values. But values are malleable. Values change and shift in conversation. So in conversation and consideration. And so if, you know, you're getting lots of TV and you're getting all these kinds of messages everywhere that this is how you become, this is how you get modern, this is what it means to have something, you're not anybody if you don't have, you know, like whatever kind of genes, you know, gap genes or whatever, then it's understandable, and especially also if your livelihood is there. So hopefully there would be, so one of the things you can do is create spaces for other kinds of value systems to get to come out in those cultures. Maybe some come from the culture, maybe some don't come from that culture, but some come from researchers like yourself who say, have you thought about what this is doing to the biodiversity? Is that something that's important to you? I mean, and again, this is the role of science education too, in thinking about these kinds of things. So yeah, so there are tensions and there aren't uniform ways of thinking, but that's why it's all got to be put out there in the public sphere so we can wrangle about the differences. And that's where philosophers come in, or those with philosophical training. I should say those with training in philosophy, not just professional philosophers.
We should wrap things up.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.